Hello everyone, I'm Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary ideas and more to help you become a literary expert. So if that sounds exactly like what you need, then make sure you hit the subscribe button below. So in today's video, we are looking at the idea of feminism in Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale. Or more specifically, we're looking at whether or not this novel can really be called feminist in the more conventionally understood sense of the word. So as a woman who prides herself on being fiercely independent and assertive, I'm 100% for championing gender equality and female rights. Goes without saying. But that said, I've come to a stage in life where I've grown to be wary of any labels or ideological isms, especially when there is a politicized agenda attached to it. So anything that divides people into distinct or polarizing groups of thought is politicizing. And feminism is arguably one of the most polarizing issues in cultural politics today. So while it's very common to apply a politicized framework in literary analysis, and that's pretty much the foundation upon which the whole critical theory industry is built on, I've always felt that politicizing literature is an act in denying, or at least to some extent, the very nuance that's at the heart of literary writing. And The Handmaid's Tale, despite having acquired this hallowed reputation for being this 21st century feminist gospel par excellence, is an unfortunate victim, I feel, of the sort of politicizing tendency that often does literature a major disservice. So of course it's a good thing to see more and more high schools around the world prescribing such an intelligent book as part of their English courses. But I feel like if we slap a feminist label on it and force students to just read it as this pro-woman or man-hating piece of fictional pamphlet, then that really misses a whole lot of nuance in Atwood's writing. Indeed, Atwood herself rejects this feminist categorization of her book, as she says in the introduction to the 2017 vintage edition of Handmaid. So as you can see, it's basically Atwood's way of saying that her book has nothing to do with the reductive or else extreme feminist narrative of women forever oppressed in a patriarchal social structure. In fact, I'd even argue that Atwood comes across a bit anti-feminism at points in the novel, in her biting satires of collective sister or womanhood initiatives, but also in her conscious ungendering of descriptions about the female body, which forces the reader to view the female protagonist, Offred's narrative and thoughts as being those of a unique human individual with both feminine and masculine traits, rather than this card-carrying advocate with all the expected feminist associations of female empowerment, resistance against the patriarchy, anger towards men, etc. So, in the spirit of seeing Handmaid as a humanistic rather than feministic novel, let's dive into 3 specific moments from the book to explore how Atwood presents women as complex, nuanced humans who cannot and must not be boxed in by these gendered frameworks or labels. Let's dive straight into it. One of the more common, if not trite, tropes in feminism is this idea of sisterhood, where women feel this natural affection and loyalty for each other on the basis of nothing else but their biological commonality. But time and again, history, literature, and perhaps even our own lives would have shown us that this is a largely unicorn and rainbows quixotic point of view. And that when push comes to shove, where individual interests are at stake, women, like men, are just as ready to throw each other under the bus, not because they hate their own kind, but simply because they are behaving as humans naturally would in a Darwinian environment. If you think that this is a ghastly, cynical take on things, then just consider the following moment in chapter 13 of Handmaid, where the handmaids gather for the ritualized group shaming session called testifying. Now notice how Offred's default reaction to Janine, who is a fellow handmaid, is not sympathy for her traumatic experience, but suspicion over whether Janine's trauma had actually happened. Offred may sound matter-of-fact when she points out that Janine had told the same story last week and suggests that the story may not even be true. But the implication here is that Janine is probably making this anecdote up for shock value or to seek attention. There's the perverse phenomenon of these pseudo-therapy testifying sessions as places where the handmaids must confess to past sexual sins, and it's actually safer to have stuff to confess than to not, which creates an incentive for people to lie about the traumaticness of their pasts. By the way, guys, if you find this video helpful so far, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my top grade lit study content going forward. I'd also encourage you to check out my membership program by clicking the join button below if you want exclusive access to members only study content and make special video requests. I'll see you there. But despite being aware of this institutionalized mental torture game that's conditioning everyone's behavior, Offred demonstrates what's perhaps a very human impulse of assuming the worst in others with her immediate skepticism towards Janine's honesty, rather than focusing on the objectively terrifying nature of Janine's experience, real or otherwise. As this moment continues, we see that Offred isn't alone in her judgment, as the aunts rile up the rest of the handmaids in collective slut-shaming condemnation against Janine. Chants are a staple in tribal societies and a popular political tool in totalitarian states used to direct mass emotions towards a common enemy. And if you've read George Orwell's 1984 or William Golding's Lord of the Flies, you will know that the quickest way to create a violent mob is to get everyone bleating out a series of chants in unison. In 1984, it was the Death to Goldstein chants during the 2 minutes hate sessions, and in Lord of the Flies, it was the boys' frenzied exhortations to kill the pig, slit her throat, spill her blood. And in Handmaids, at this moment, the same mob mentality is being cooked up as all the women at the testifying session partake in these mind-numbing, mob-like 3x3 chants directed towards Janine, who is the temporary scapegoat. In an instant, there's no consideration of sisterhood or womanhood whatsoever, no presence of empathy, no room for compassion, only a woeful regression back to their animalistic selves, at once cruel and cowardly in their willingness to attack Janine out of a need for tribalistic conformity and a desire for crude self-protection. The references to fire and Janine's burned eyes suggest that she has been served up as a ritualistic offering on the violent altar of this groupthink episode, while the simile of her being weak, squirmy, blotchy pink like a newborn mouse highlights the extent to which Offred's own mind has descended from the human to the animalistic, let alone seeing a fellow handmaid as a sister or a woman. Offred no longer sees Janine as a human being, but instead this pathetic, disgusting pest of an animal that deserves to be extinguished. Yet this mental lapse is momentary, as reflected in Offred's self-conscious, shameful reflection of her behaviour at this point, as her remark that "I used to think well of myself, I didn't then," reveals the moral weakness that overtook her in this moment. Shortly after this incident, which somewhat ironically adds to Offred's own bank of trauma, Offred contemplates on how her view of the female body, or of her own body, has shifted since becoming a Galilean handmaid, as her sole point of existence has been reduced to that of procreation. Now, this passage is especially striking because it symbolizes a process whereby the female body is neutered, even if only in Offred's own mind. Atwood goes from evoking the quintessential motif of womanhood, menstrual blood, to the image of the female body as an instrument of self-agency, to finally the disintegration of this body into mere flesh, at once formless and genderless. This transition poses an intriguing suggestion, which is that the ultimate means for a woman to regain power over her own body is perhaps to effect a mental and spiritual dissociation from those very traits that make her body female, and to reconceive herself as simply this mass of flesh-like atoms, as reinforced by the numinous yet poignant metaphor of "I'm a cloud congealed around a central object, the shape of a pear." In Offred's case, This reimagining of herself as dissolved substance is a coping mechanism to deal with the disappointment of not bearing a child, and that empty, again sense of despair is no doubt something that one too many infertile women can empathise with. Yet Atwood seems to be suggesting that instead of wallowing in self-pitying despair, one needs only to reframe the state of childless hollowness as a radical reimagination of the self, not as a female body with a preordained mission of childbearing, but as a free soul floating through space and time, unbound by the expected rites and rituals of menstrual cycles and childbirth. There is solace and a moment's freedom to be gained in this mental baptism of self-identity, which for Offred represents a sliver of hope in her otherwise deeply entrapped existence in Gilead. Now, in some ways, Offred's mother is the poster child of the liberated, countercultural feminist, androgynous fashion wearer, card-carrying rights advocate and activist, proud single mom, tongue-in-cheek fun poker of men. She embodies it all, which is also why she has no place in Gilead and was exiled to the colonies. But in the detailed portrayal of Offred's mother in chapter 20, when Offred spots her in an unwoman documentary that Aunt Lydia shows the handmaids, we see that she doesn't so much represent that stereotypical image of a militant feminist as she does symbolize that every man and every woman's desire for individual agency and self-expression. In the documentary, Offred's mother is shown as a young female rights activist rallying in the streets, representing the bygone days when women were allowed to openly express their views and champion social causes. Now notice the repeated references to the kind of outfit, the sort of thing that Moira once wore, the sort of thing I can remember wearing. This lexical ambiguity suggests Offred's inability to describe exactly what her mother's clothing style is, which from the reader's point of view is ironic because her mother has got what most of us would think of as just casual wear, albeit a touch androgynous, but nothing really unconventional. Yet Offred herself, as a red dress only wearing handmaid, has almost forgotten about the fact that women used to be able to choose what they could wear, and the alien sight of her mother in these clothes triggers a nostalgic longing in her for a freer past, which is a budding desire that will gradually snowball into her ultimate act of defiance against the state at the end of the story, i.e. her sexual consummation with Nick, the commander's chauffeur. But the purpose of seeing her mother as this free, liberated woman is to activate a dormant awareness in Offred herself, namely that she and the others could, if they wanted to, break free from the social strictures that so suffocate them at present, which is implied by the series of self-reflective questions Offred poses when she wonders, is this an oversight? Have we gotten away with something? Or is this what we're intended to see? To remind us of the old days of no safety. The irony here is that the aunts are showing Offred and the handmaids these unruly, wild unwomen as a cautionary example of how not to behave. But the fact that everyone breathes in and that there's the stirrings of passion subtly hinted at by the simile of their breath being like wind over grass suggests that no amount of social oppression can contain the deep, raw desires of the women for true agency and freedom. And it's very likely that these documentary viewing sessions are feeding the energy for the underground May Day resistance movement. As the moment continues, the symbolism of Offred's mother evolves to take on an additional layer of nuance. Now, it would be hugely tempting to read this scene as the aha, I told you so proof that Handmaid is a feminist novel, with a string of trenchant pro-choice slogans about women's rights over their reproductive and bodily faculties, and Offred's mother with the others raising their fists in the air in standard protesting stance. The female symbol is alluded to with the circle and stem imagery, but hidden in this is also the biblical imagery of an apple and a cross, which evokes the Genesis story of Adam and Eve's tasting of the forbidden fruit, the rest of humanity as their post-lapsarian consequence, and Jesus' crucifixion as the salvation of mankind. If one recalls that it was Eve who had first tasted the fruit and then tempted Adam to also take a bite, then perhaps this biblical allusion reflects that for most of history, there's an impulse for women to point the finger first at the women as being the instigator of sin, as the siren-like Delilah who tempts the many Samsons who simply didn't know better. The blame, it seems, always has to lie with the woman first. But what this suggests, anyway, is that for all women's efforts at asserting their agency and demanding their rights, they are ultimately subject to the macro forces of narrative control, which are often dominated and written by long-standing social and religious institutions with outsized power. And these institutions, as we clearly see from the willing enablement of the aunts, are by no means singularly dominated by men. Indeed, if we consider the majority of the anti-equal rights amendment activists during 1980s America, the majority of them were full-time homemaking women who would apparently write letters to senators in their spare time petitioning against the ratification of this gender and reproductive rights bill. And if we consider that, it becomes quite clear that this entire narrative of women having each other's back doesn't always hold true in reality. We see then that both genders are complicit in the grand historical project of subjugating weaker communities. And what constitutes weak or powerful is often dependent upon which way the broader political and social winds blow at a given point in time. So no matter how much one single individual, like Offred's mother, demonstrates the courage to rise above these forces of repression, the sheer force of historical and cultural fossilization makes it almost impossible for women to win the fight against structural oppression in some form or another. This is why Offred's mother is eventually seen to emerge as part of the crowd, vanishing in the masses as another anonymous speck, despite the moment of glorious defiance she embodies as an activist. And if this seems too pessimistic a reading, then that would also make sense given the novel's glaringly dystopian nature. But of course, it is by crystallizing this apocalyptic vision of the future that Atwood can sharpen our radars to the inevitable forces which wish to make it a reality. So, can we call Handmaid a feminist novel? And honestly, does it even matter? I think far from worrying about designating the novel this feminist or pro-woman label, whatever, perhaps we can gain greater value from reflecting on how the broader contextual circumstances like history, politics, society, and culture are always lurking as these looming, powerful forces behind every individual and community's actions, regardless of whether one is a man or a woman, or whether a social system is patriarchal or matriarchal or otherwise. As long as desire, power, ego, and the instinct for self-protection are well and alive, then people will be driven to act in the most ghastly ways towards each other, often without even being fully conscious of their behavior. This ideal of collective sisterhood and feminist camaraderie are largely just that, ideals, elements of which we can strive to achieve, but no feminist agenda can override the forces of our deeply ingrained human nature. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on feminism in Handmaid and what you think the novel suggests about gender dynamics and the role of women in society. Leave a comment below so that we can get this very important discussion going. And for your next video, I recommend that you watch my analysis on the two main contexts in Handmaid, which will give you a broader insight and overview into the historical influences behind Atwood's writing of the novel. As always, hit that thumbs up button below if you found this video helpful at all, so that YouTube will know to spread it to more passionate literary learners all around the world, and that you can encourage me to keep making these useful lit study videos for you. Please subscribe if you haven't already and switch on that bell notification so that you don't miss out on any of my weekly future videos. You can also consider joining my membership program for exclusive video requests and essay review perks. Check that out by clicking the join button below, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!